It is I, Tantus Narvan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on EARTHDAWN. We finished up talking about another type of magic. Today, I am introducing you to spell magic. Now, adepts use their magic to fuel their talents. They use it to fuel their connections with magic items and other things. But there is a group that has developed spell patterns of magic which they can weave threads into to allow energy from the astral plane to travel from that into this pattern to create magical effects, and that is a magician. One of a rare kind of breed of adepts. There are few of them in comparison to most of the other adepts. Each of these has this mastery of using this spell pattern, charging it with the magical energies of the astral plane itself in order to affect the reality around them. And each type of magician has their own elements to it. Let's talk about, though, the basics of spellcasting, because there are actually 3 types of spellcasting that exist out there. Each one of them has their own strengths and weaknesses, which I will get into them more later on. For now, let's just talk about the basics of them. It's also important to note that all 3 of these do share similar elements, but also have their differences. The first one is just called spellcasting. It's the basic one. This is using a spell matrix to channel your spells in there, basically placing your spells pattern and threads in there, channeling the energy through the matrix itself. This is also called matrix casting. It is the most common form of using being a magician and using spells there is. Most common spell casting. The second method. The most dangerous method is raw magic. In this case, you draw upon the energies of the astral plane and channel it directly through yourself when you're casting the spell. You don't have a matrix, you don't have a go-between. You're using this energy directly with yourself. This is often used as a tool of last resort, because whatever spell matrices I have established, let's say I need a spell to survive and I don't have it as one of the ones weaved into my spell matrices, I could use this raw magic and channel it myself to cast this spell which I hadn't prepared earlier. In doing so, I get that spell, I can cast it, but there are drawbacks to it. There are a mixed bag of advantages and disadvantages. First off, a disadvantage. Oftentimes, doing this will cause you damage. It will hurt you to use raw magic with a spell. Granted, using raw magic means you don't necessarily have to worry about disciplines anymore. Raw magic itself blends it. The raw magic of the astral plane blends the disciplines. So the fact is, you could use this to cast a spell you normally wouldn't have for your discipline even. The other problem, though, is it could muddle you. It could pollute you effectively. Whatever energies are within the astral space are directly going into you. And horrors can use this to track you and mark you and go after you. So that is one of the reasons why this is oftentimes of last resort. It's like a beacon for horrors. And the last type is grimoire spellcasting. It sounds exactly what it means. You're using a grimoire, a special book, in order to cast it. You're going through that book rather than a spell matrices. The problem with grimoire casting is it takes longer and it is more difficult than either raw magic or normal spell casting with a matrix. Thing about it is, though, it technically is less dangerous than raw magic. It does give you some more options than, let's say, the spell matrix would have, but it is also then more dangerous than the spell matrix itself. So it's sort of in between the two of these. I'll talk about more, especially when using grimoires later. There are 3 important talents that your spellcaster is going to need if they're going to be casting spells. Spellcasting, thread weaving, and spell matrix. Those first 2 are what you're going to use to craft, weave the spell, cast it. You're effectively going to use the spell casting to get together the pattern, weave the threads in to power it. The matrix, the spell matrix, is what you're going to use to safely channel it, not worry about casting the spell and attracting a horror. So that's why these 3 work together in tandem for you to cast your spells normally. The Will Force talent you can also increase in order to channel some extra magical energies into your spells. But let's break down each of these talents a little more individually. Spellcasting is the first talent that's most important. The 4 spellcasting disciplines are each going to have this, and it's their ability to basically channel the magical abilities in the proper ways to cast the spell. That's the easiest way to describe it. It is going to be your, of course, spellcasting rank plus your perception step to figure out what your spellcasting test will be. Your spellcasting test will, of course, have a difficulty number, in this case called a casting difficulty. That's normally going to be the spell defense of whatever you're casting the spell on, though each spell will give an appropriate number of how to figure it out. The spell will tell you, oh, this is what you're going to use to figure out your difficulty number in this case. Now in combat, spellcasting tests are usually considered an attack, and should you get excellent results, you can get an armor defeating hit on the appropriate defense you're attempting to overcome. Let's talk about thread weaving. Thread weaving is unique to each of the 4 disciplines that learn spellcasting. Each of them has effectively their own version of it. They work exactly the same. It allows you to weave threads in your spells in order to empower them, or to weave threads into your spell matrices in order to effectively attach a spell into that matrice. So both of these are what you're doing with these thread weaving. Either you're using it to empower your spell in the first place, or, well, you probably will be doing both, and you're also using it to link it into your matrices. But this also means that you can only use spells when you're weaving them related to your discipline. Those are the only ones you can weave. This does actually mean that should you somehow be able to take thread weaving from another discipline, basically maybe I'm a wizard and I'm choosing that I'm also taking elementalist thread weaving, I would have access to those spells too, with the ability to learn and cast them. It just means each of them has their own version of this thread weaving. Then when we talk about spell matrix, we have to talk about the history of them. Originally, when spellcasting, especially before the Scourge, magicians just drew upon the raw energies of the astral space. But as the Scourge approached, wizards began to die. Spellcasters, magicians began to die. Because, of course, they were beginning to attract horrors. And it took some time and plenty of deaths for people to start to learn about this. And of course, then they had to figure out a way in order to create a barrier between themselves, some way that they can conceal and protect themselves from these energies that effectively create them a beacon for horrors. So this is where the beginning development of matrices occur. Originally, there was like a certain item that one of them a magician would use that they specifically would weave everything through, creating a specific matrix that they could use in order to cast their spells. The problem with these early attempts at it, having this matrix item, means if the item is destroyed or somehow rendered inoperable, they can't safely cast spells. That's where the spell matrix talent comes in. Spell matrix allowed for a spellcaster to weave in this matrix of area within their true pattern, where they could attach these spells and weave in threads into them, basically making a sort of cutoff area within themselves that they could use in order to cast it. So they created effectively a little matrix within their own true patterns rather than an item on them. The use of this has opened it up to make it a lot easier for magic users to cast spells without danger, for magicians too. The use of things like robes and the older kind of matrices have died out because of this, because now it's easy, portable, recreatable matrices can be created within the user's own spell pattern using a talent. Now, some spells can be too complex to completely put into a matrix. What happens then is the magician will effectively put a compressed shorthand version in there and will weave threads into it at the time of casting that allow them to get the full effects of said spell that you've put in there. Afterwards, though, it would go back to its compressed state within the matrix, and effectively you would have to reweave these threads again every time you're casting this compressed spell. But this allows for more powerful spells that normally wouldn't be in a matrix, at least a simple matrix like most people tend to create. You could do it successfully. The matrix you're doing to do this in the first place is going to be complex, but even then, you still have to have this compression. This is the main form of spellcasting that magicians will do. Raw magic and grimoire magic have dangers to them, and that is why they are not used nearly as much. Very rarely. Now, a spell matrix has disadvantages. It limits the circle of spells that you can actually use. Your thread weaving talent will tell you the kind of power of spells you theoretically could learn. That will tell you kind of the level of circle in that retrospect, but your actual circle itself is a limiting factor on it. So there's a combination of all of your statistics which can tell you what circle of spells you can actually use. So the spell matrix ends up being a limiting factor on it. While using something like raw magic and something, it's opening up the talent, the abilities to, with the talent, to cast the spells of the appropriate discipline to whatever your maximum would be. So the fact is, yes, if I have a much higher rank in my thread weaving, I can get much more powerful spells with raw magic than if my circle wasn't high enough to match that. So yes, the matrix is a limiting factor. You can still cast those spells, but it's dangerous. More on the spell matrices and the way these all works a little later on. I will discuss it. Now, Will Force talent, you're not going to normally start out with. You have to be 5th circle in order to start taking it. Up until then, you're going to go straight off of your willpower when it comes to spell casting. Will Force allows you to use the talent and add to that, effectively add to your ability to spellcast, enhance it even farther. So it's a talent you can use specifically to enhance the effects of your spellcasting and make it more potent. So that's it for today. I introduced you to spell magic. The probably more common type of magic, the specific type of magic that you're going to encounter. We talked about patterns, thread magic, and blood magic, but this is spell magic. It's a different version of it. It's casting spells. It's what the 4 magician disciplines are going to have to worry about. And I dived into the 4 talents they're going to be taking. The 3 that you're going to take right away, and of course the one that you're going to take when you get to 5th circle. All of them are used in tandem in order for you to use your spells properly and safely. Of course, there are other methods of spell casting, which I did briefly talk about, which you can use, but they have their dangers linked to them. Next time, I'm going to continue diving into spell magic with spell threads, learning spells, and then beginning to talk about grimoires. So, if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave it in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows you support the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon, link in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.